Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Fire and Safety Division CPD event. This is a continuation from last year's discussion in relation to the remediation of fire safety defects in apartment buildings and other similar buildings. We have the pleasure of Mr. Mark McDaid, who is 20 years chartered fire safety engineer. Spent 12 years of his career over in Australia, and I can see you have a few UK education links there along the way. This evening, Mark is going to present to us his experience of dealing with the remediation of fire defects in apartments in Australia. Please use the Q&A function for any questions for our session at the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Particularly thanks for anyone who's been to the IFE conference earlier on and made it over to watch this short seminar. Hopefully we can give you some information on remediation of the fire safety defects from an Australian perspective. I'll go through some of the contents, the context of the fire engineer and the particular focus in New South Wales and how remediation is dealt. What type of defects do we normally see in residential buildings in Australia? Are they the same as Ireland? Do they come from the same problems, whether it's competency of the practitioners or the licensing of the builders or subbies? We'll look at some of the common issues that we find and see in fire orders, particularly residential buildings at top level, attic fire separation or boundary distances between buildings, fire stopping, fire doors, egress issues. We'll look at what is an actual fire order, what's in a fire order as well, and how and when one might receive a fire order. What if everything complies with the original as built docs? What do we do in those cases? And what legislation applies? Can I appeal? Can I ask for dispensations? Can I ask for concessions? And where those would fall into responsibility as well, whether it's a fire brigade matter or a non-fire brigade matter. And how would one comply with a fire order? And the pros and cons of receiving a fire order. By the very nature of receiving a fire order, you think they're all cons, but there are some pros. And we'll end up with some conclusions. A little bit about me before we get started. 21 years as a fire engineer, working purely in fire engineering all those 21 years, work as an expert witness in New South Wales Supreme Court proceedings on both combustible cladding and residential defects. Graduated in 2003 at Letterkenny, worked with Michael Slattery Associates from 2003 to 2012, and then in 2012 moved over to Australia. A couple of years later, set up my own business in Australia called MCD Fire Engineering, and on the bodies of various groups and professional boards as education and training and subject matter expert on the panel that assesses chartered engineers in Australia, and recently just got the URING qualification for Engineers Europe. So getting into the context of an actual fire safety engineer in Australia, it's somewhat different to what we're all used to here in Ireland. So just to give you what it means to be a fire engineer in Australia, there's the fundamental performance requirements of the Building Code of Australia, or the BCA. Think of it as the collection of all the technical guidance documents from A to Z. But they're built into two streams, if you will, but they're under the heading performance requirements. So the two streams, or they can be done in parallel, is a performance solution, or a deemed where a fire engineer is required, or a deemed to satisfy solution. That's the prescriptive. There's no fire engineering in that. Essentially, when you have no performance or alternative solution, as the old name would have been called, there's no fire engineer, there's no fire service generally, and there's no what's called an A1 unrestricted building surveyor or a signed certifier, because essentially it's considered a tick box exercise. If you comply with the prescriptive codes, then it's a clause by clause assessment of that building, and there is no need for a fire engineer. It's a building surveyor's job. But that building surveyor can bring in at their own discretion the fire engineer, the structural engineer, mechanical, electrical, hydraulics, to assure them or give some guidance to them. But essentially, the role of a fire engineer is purely to do performance solutions. When it's brought in, we have strict licensing and registration requirements. Fair Trading, which is the governing body, the regulatory body that governs us, basically put us through the rigor every single year in our renewals. We have a director's ID, whereby if we leave one company and join another, that the ID follows us. So if there's any litigation, it follows that director's ID. There is ICRIT ratings, and basically that's the like scores on doors, as they call in Australia. It's how good a company is or is not in accordance with the eyes of the regulator. And there is liquidated damages period. So essentially, for buildings that are built, there traditionally used to be 2 years liquidated damages. Now it's 10 years. The legislation requirements under the EPA, the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, and the DBPA, the Design Building Practitioners Act, that are specifically for residential, set out that you need to be registered as a certifier, fire safety grade, a design practitioner, and a professional engineer. So it's not just a chartered engineer, you have to register in various other streams, and you have to have insurance. If you don't have any of those, you simply cannot work in New South Wales. Other states are a little bit different, but you simply cannot work as a fire engineer or open a practice as a fire engineer. And that's the legislative requirements, not even a commercial requirement. They're somewhat different and sometimes higher. The insurance requirement for a fire engineer, both as a company and as an individual, is that you need to be insured before you can do any project as a fire engineer. And that includes that if you retire today, you carry runoff insurance for 10 years. And that could, if you play, your cards right into retirement, you could put it into the coffers of a runoff insurance policy, whereby you pay somewhere 4 to 6 times that last year's insurance. Now, given the post-Grenfell insurance requirements, my insurance as a company went from 7 to 150 grand. That's a big bill to pay if I wanted to retire tomorrow. So basically, it's a lot of money, and there's a lot of responsibility on your head. Essentially, some people view this as a target on your back, both as a building surveyor and as a registered fire engineer. If you have none of the above, you simply cannot work by law. You cannot open a practice. You cannot work as a fire engineer. You cannot do anything. You might work in a fire engineering practice, but you cannot sign anything off. You cannot endorse any reports. You cannot certify anything. So that's the context of a fire engineer in Australia, and it's only from a performance solution perspective. So next we look at some of the common defects in residential buildings. Are they the same as they are here in Ireland? Is there the same reasoning? Is it to do with competency of engineers or builders? Is there licensing issues about various trades? And then we can look at whether the route to remediation is best done by the fire order, or what's called a DA, a development application or development approval, which is like a planning permission. And a CC and CDC is a construction certificate, or for a fit out, for material alterations, it's a CDC. And essentially, that's like your standard fire cert application and commencement notice. The code of practice for remediation on defects is the Irish reference. We'll touch on that a little bit later. But essentially, when you have a fire order, you don't need planning permission. Essentially, the council are the ones in control of that fire order process, and they're the ones setting out what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and who needs to be involved in the various stages of that process. So they're very much in control of it. They don't necessarily sign it off, but they're in control of who should sign it off, i.e. a registered building surveyor and a registered fire engineer and all the other registered practitioners that go along with it. Some of the common issues that we'll find is up in the attic at the top floor. The ceiling is either not a fire rated ceiling, or it's interrupted by the internal non-fire rated partitions. So you might have bricks and blocks between the units, but then internally you might have bathrooms and bedrooms that are not fire rated, and they actually go through the fire rated ceiling. So you've got an interruption of the fire rated ceiling, and the way it's worded in the Australian system is throughout the entire top floor. So that needs to be one uninterrupted ceiling throughout the entire top floor. So if you don't have a fire rated ceiling, quite often the walls are not extended up to the underside of the roof covering, and that's the sheet itself, not the battens or anything else. The only thing allowed to pass through those walls is a timber batten, nothing else. Fire stopping is pretty much the same here as it is in Australia. There's problems with fire stopping all the time, especially in old existing buildings. Boundary distances or fire separations. Houses in Australia typically are 900 millimeters to their boundary, whereas non-domestic, so flats, apartments, 3-story walk-ups or even 10-story buildings, there's a minimum requirement to the boundary of 3 meters. It doesn't matter how many windows are on it. There's no such thing as enclosing rectangle methods, BR 187 or anything else. It's just simple. If you're within 3 meters, you fire rate the windows or provide drenchers or provide shutters, or else you do a fire engineering solution to justify not doing it, or as a reduced form of protection. Other ones are openings that of adjoining compartments, one facing another or at 90 degrees. Spandrel separation is essentially the external wall that separates the vertical windows from one level to another level. They're a minimum 900 mil separation. You'll see something very similar to that in the TGB 24. So that's been in Australia for years, and quite often in the older buildings, they either don't have it or it's less than the 900 mil requirement. Fire stopping, as I said, is always there. It's always one of the defects that we pick up during our audit process. So they're either non-existent, or they're non-compliant, or they're old pipes in old buildings with cement grout and sometimes paper backing as to stop the cement falling out, that are no longer acceptable, obviously. And there's often quite a lot of above ceiling penetrations that, the subcontractors think you'll never see it. And then we'll show you some examples of, we see it and it's pretty bad. Fire doors, the common issues with fire doors, both in residential and non-residential buildings, both here and overseas, is gaps, clearances, rebates, hardwares, tagging, modifications, and not having the right test reports for any of these. They're not installed in accordance with the test report. And in Australia, there's a very exacting term. It basically says, if you've got a fire rated system, whether it's a firewall, fire door, fire damper, they have to be installed exactly as per the tested prototype. No variation. So you can't accept a fire rated system in a gyprock wall that is going to go into a masonry wall and vice versa. Egress issues, common issues that we usually find there is clearances in stairs. They're at least a meter wide, or required to be a meter wide. They might be 900 population. There might be more than 100 people using an exit, a single exit. That's usually not allowed. Inward opening doors, travel distances, and escape pass windows. So all the kind of stuff that we would commonly see anywhere, really. Some of the fire safety defects, as we said, up in the attic, there's, an attempt at putting in some, fire rated plasterboard in a very bad way and not fire stopping it correctly. That silver foil is what they call in Australia sarking. We might call felt over here, but essentially there's insulation above that sarking, and the actual corrugated iron that is above that is another 50, 60 mil away. So again, that's not acceptable. And the sarking is permitted to pass over it, but only the sarking, not the combustible insulation that is under the corrugated iron. This is very common, purlins going through fire-rated walls, and not even an attempt to fire stop it or wrap it or coat back or anything there. Other issues are very bad attempts at putting in fire collars in tight junctions, not really foreseeing it or coordinating services. Conduits, flexible conduits going through masonry walls and just being butchered out of one side and not fitted with either fire collars or what's called volcano type graphite-based intumescent systems, and lack of separation between individual penetrations. That one speaks the obvious. The electrician should have known better on that one. And the same with all of these. Basically, these are the same types of problems that we find here in Ireland that are universal. They appear to be universal. They've just filled this with a lot of ProMat sealant, and it's not a tested system. Neither is this. We hate to see this pink foam. And once we walk in a site with pink foam, we're essentially going to the super and going, get everyone off the job and get them, into a room and tell them what they need to do. Because once we see this pink foam, we threaten to walk off the job. We're not going to sign it off. It's just, it's schoolboy stuff. And then this is above the ceiling. Generally, they're above an apartment entry door, where you can see the pipes from the toilets above coming down, and they're penetrating through what's called Hebel or aerated concrete. So these are like 75 mil aerated concrete. So it's like a lightweight concrete panel system. And you can see there's an attempt on the left with the ProMat canister collars, but very bad attempt at sealing the wall. And then they've just butchered the wall with the PVC pipe penetrations. Same with this, we've got, you know, a fire collar above there somewhere, and the requirements on the fire collar manufacturer is that you need at least 20 mil clearance for the heat to get in above that, to stop or to allow it to heat up and activate. And now the conflict here is, there's, you know, energy requirements about heat loss and everything else. So there's a bit of a conflict between energy and fire. So what do? You know, do you leave the 20 mil gap and forget about the energy losses or heat losses? So there's always going to be a conflict with that. This is example of a very bad attempt of vermiculite being used at a penetration of a steel beam going through a firewall and the purlin up above it. So again, same issues that we see all the time. This guy went to the trouble of patching a hole, only then for the electrician to come back in and just put another 2 cables in the top and do a really bad fire stopping system of it. Again, fire collars are often installed very, very badly. This should have been coordinated, should have been cast in, and then the retrofit was just offline and really bad. This is looking through a typical fire-rated stud wall. You've got 2 layers on the near side and in the very kind of bright white where the green and yellow cables are, as well as the 2 layers at the back side. So they've just core holed a massive, like 100 mil diameter hole for these couple of cables. And didn't do anything about it. And this is above the ceiling. And this is kind of from another, the other side of that wall, where they made some attempt to do it, but again, it's not good enough. PVC pipes going through the same walls, bad attempts at filling up. This was literally just the cap end of a PVC pipe sitting about 10 mil behind these ProMat mastic. So they didn't even hide the fact that it was a bad job. It was just brutal. This is a bad attempt at putting in a lintel over a fire door using timber, which, you know, by default is not allowed. You're not allowed to use combustible material in fire-rated walls. And, you know, there is combustible materials inside that fire-rated wall as well. This was the same wall where that timber lintel was. And this was because they didn't have room to put in a fire-rated door frame. They just decided to put a bit of angle iron and chop the door up a bit and throw it in there, and thinking again they could get away with that and call it an access panel. This is, you know, same builder, same problems. This is a fire door that they put into a penthouse that they modified after the fact and decided the door wasn't, or the door was too big that they had left over, so they cut it up and they just chopped the head off, they chopped the sides off and everything else, and we were like, guys, this is just no good. And then, you know, the really bad, obviously, they don't even care. You know, a lot of this is, you know, one screw and, you know, let's just throw it in there. I don't know what you're thinking as a tradie, of, you know, thinking that you're going to get away with this. And quite often, this is what we'll see, you know, in very, very, very bad jobs, including putting in, you know, intumescent fire dampers with mastic only, not fixed, and not even in the fire-rated portion of the wall. Whereas we get into the kind of stuff that can be done right. This is, you know, we're at the commissioning stage of a 40-story student accommodation building. And this is people who take pride in their work. In terms of the wrapping, this guy didn't actually need to wrap all those cables the way he did, even though that was a fire-rated wall behind that was going into it. There was a concession because this is a highly sprinklered building, and it was between 2 spaces that were deemed to be sterile or relatively sterile. But equally, well tagged, badged, fire stopping, fire collars, you know, names on and labels and IDs on all, not just the fire dampers, but everything. And they've got a register to boot for all of these. And it just shows you when you walk through a site and you start to see this from the get-go, you kind of go, okay, I can sit back a little bit easier now going through the site. I won't take my eyes off things, but I have a little bit more confidence now in the trades that are going through this building. And, you know, you're looking at everything still, but you're not as frustrated at the end of the day. So going into what is a fire order, you know, we find that there's loads of problems. The EP&A Act, or the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979, basically requires that council have a duty of care to respond to any complaints related to fire safety, and almost always, in my experience, always respond to those. So they can come from a member of the public or other departments such as the fire service, because the council are the authority having jurisdiction. Once a building is occupied, they are the person, and it's in their local authority, they are the authority having jurisdiction. And because they're the authority having jurisdiction, as part of that early stage, they can either seek an audit or an assessment, or actions or undertakings to get submissions of documentation or other evidence to determine whether the building complies or not. They're issued under the 1979 Act, so it's obviously been around for a long time. There are various types of orders. So unless it's emergency order, and we have something similar in the Fire Services Act here, all orders must be preceded by a notice of intention to serve an order, and basically what you must do in the time frame to do that. And that basically allows the owners or the representatives to give representations to be considered before an order is officially served, but it usually is. So as I said, it's usually converted from what's an NOI, notice of intention, to a formal fire safety order. The legislation that applies in Australia, as I said, the 1979 Act. In Ireland, we have the Planning and Development Act, obviously is going into a bill at the minute. It's very similar in its operation, but doesn't cover the fire safety notices or the orders, whereas the Fire Services Act 1981 and 2003 usually do. In Ireland, obviously, we have the Fire Services Act and going into Section 18 about general obligations, but again, limited in application. In Australia, any building can be subject to a fire order. In Ireland, they may seek to reduce it to a reasonable level. That's similar to in Australia. Sections 18A requires the relevant, the minister can issue relevant codes of practice, which we have now in Ireland with the fire safety assessment or the code of practice for remediation. Section 19 obviously deals with potentially dangerous buildings, but again, it's limited in its application. And then all the other acts deal with specific problems such as, factories and petroleum premises and the likes of that. Section 20 in Ireland would be the fire safety notice served by the fire authority, which could be the city or county council. No set timelines, but typically priority related. If you look at tier 1, 2, 3 in the Code of Practice 23, you get some idea there. Section 21 in Ireland would deal with appeals as 14 days. In Australia, it's 28. And obviously the Health, Safety, Welfare at Work Act deals with some of these, but typically it refers back to the Fire Services Act. So the legislation in Ireland also covers the kind of what we would refer to as defects liability period, whereby you can be served an enforcement notice up to 5 years after the building has been completed. In Australia, this is how a fire order would come to fruition. It would basically be captured under these 3 columns and 3 tabs to stop or to do or to stop doing things for the sake of fire safety, or to just stop an activity on the premises. So it might be a compliant building, but what you're doing in it is not compliant, i.e. setting off fireworks, or to stop using the premises full stop. It's just in such disrepair that it's not occupiable. It's not safe to occupy. In what circumstances? It basically explains that fire safety is inadequate, or the activity is life-threatening, and then the final one is when order item number 1 or 2 is already being served and nothing has happened, and it sets out who you can serve them on in each of those occurrences. There are specific checks and balances that a council, the authority having jurisdiction, need to adhere to when considering or giving an order. It's not as simple as giving it out. They have to pass certain checks. And the regulations set out that natural justice requirements must be preceded with notices to give them representations. So some of the extracts from the legislation itself: do it, can they be forced to do it, who pays for the work, recouping the costs, involvement with the fire brigade, and so on. When read along the Fire Services Act, the Building Control Act, the Safety, Health, Welfare at Work Act in Ireland, and the Code of Practice of 2023, they're pretty much covered like what we have in New South Wales. So usually what's in the fire order, you'll have the legislation, and the order makes reference to the specific legislation that it's been served under. It'll give the reasons as to why it's been served. Usually it's relating to deficiencies in fire safety as listed. It'll give you the timing when you have to do certain things, and they'll usually start off with some low-hanging fruit, like fix the emergency lighting within 30 days, or do something else in 60, 90, or all the way up to 360 days and more. It'll outline the appeals process and what you should do if you want to appeal it. And then the penalties if you don't do it. And the penalties can be quite high. An owner's OMC or a strata company is essentially a company, and it can face fines of $5 million. Or an individual can face fines of 1 million. So they're quite hefty. And they usually mean something. If you're being served an order, they usually mean something is seriously wrong. So this was what a fire order looks like. And in green, I've highlighted it to just draw your attention. And basically, this is the first part of a fire order. This is a notice of intention to issue an order. So you're putting the owners of this apartment building on notice that says, we're going to issue you an order to upgrade the building, and that we've outlined our reasons attached to this order. So this is what the notice might look like. It'll outline that it's a notice, what legislation it's captured under, the date, to who, what the premises are, and giving them an option to provide representations by the 4th of August, and the reasons why they should not give an order, or the terms of the order, or the period of compliance with that order. And it sets out then what is going to be in that order, to do what, and it's outlined in 2, 3, and 4, and then the reasons for the order, and then the period of compliance with the order. In this particular case, although year 1 and 12 months looks pretty straightforward, they're not always as simple as that. Usually it's coinciding with a building code audit, and that audit might say do X by year 1, Y by year 2, and so on and so forth. And usually the council will match up to whatever the building code consultant will say needs to be done when it needs to be done. And it'll also outline what happens if you fail to comply with this order. It's an offense. It's against the law. You have to comply. You can appeal it, and you can go through the appeals process, but you still have to comply with the order. The lawyers can get involved, and they often do. And quite often when they read these, 9 times out of 10, it's as simple as you need to comply with the order. And in some other cases, it's overly zealous by the council, and they fight back, and sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. And then there's a penalty, as I spoke about before. Then if you fail to do it, basically the council can go out and do it themselves and recoup the costs. And there's part of that process that basically says, if you don't pay us, we'll cut off your utility. I haven't seen it ever gone as dramatically as that, but the legislation has that in there. So the right of appeal, but then it basically allows you to do all this work without planning permission, without the equivalent of a fire cert, without any of those. But there are certain conditions, you can't block roads, or, cut down trees and do other things. It all has to be as per the specific scope of works set out in the order. This is one that basically was converted from a notice of intention, and 1 month later, it was served as an order. And this particular order, which was from a different premises, basically set out you need to audit your building. So it was just made aware of a problem, and all it said to the owners is audit your building. And that usually means get a building code official and audit your building from top to bottom, and have them write a report that says where you're deficient and where you're going to fix it, or whether you want some concessions. And if you're going to do performance or alternative solutions, you need to set it out, and need to be done by an accredited professional. So what would, in what circumstances would you receive an order? It could be simply a member of the public complaint. It could be a tenant of the building. We had one where the tenant complained that his rent went up, and he called the fire brigade or the council and said, oh, my smoke alarm isn't working. And that turned into a $2 million exercise, because they came in and they had all these professionals and costings and everything else. And it was an old building. It was built in the 60s, so it wouldn't comply with contemporary codes. And he realized his errors and was like, oh, no, can I withdraw that? No, the horse is bolted. Failure to furnish what's called an annual fire safety statement renewal on time. So every single year in New South Wales, you have to furnish your fire safety schedule, which is a list of all the fire safety systems in your building, to confirm that they were checked that year at the right intervals, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months. And at each annual renewal, you send a copy to the local council, and you send a copy to the fire brigade. If they don't receive it, you'll get an automatic notification that it wasn't received. You'll get some time to fix it up. And if they don't receive it, you're essentially issued an order. They might have an ad hoc inspection. Council might be there because, so as I said, could be anything, chance inspection by the council responding to a local flood event or anything like that. Or defects claim on the building. Sometimes owners will get a little bit disgruntled at the builder not having done their job correctly. Will issue court proceedings against them. Council becomes aware of it by default, and then they issue a fire order to update the building to a better standard. Basically anything. And basically in Australia, in New South Wales particularly, their job is to actively ensure that the buildings in their area don't pose a risk to the public. And they often have a register of, what they consider high-risk buildings, hostels, residential buildings, boarding houses, and things like that, especially in sleeping quarters. Consoles can also be heightened by a member of the public, the fire brigade, or fire engineering professionals. And if they receive a complaint about this, they will often take an unannounced inspection and issue a fire order on the back of that. What if everything complies with the original as-built documentation? Well, that depends. When was it built? If it was built what's called pre-Ordinance 70, which is before the contemporary codes came in, a historic building, or was it built in the last 5 to 10 years? So there's considerations of the heritage impact, consideration of structural impact, and consideration of the cost of the upgrades. Now, there's a couple of high-profile cases in Australia and Sydney. The Opal Tower had a structural issue. They basically evacuated on, I think it's Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve. The Mascot Towers, structural issues, subsidence. They're all issues that caused the evacuation. They still haven't got back in after 5+ years, I think. And then there's heritage issues about whether they should or the heritage, that's a different legislation. And then the consideration of the owners and the tenants' displacement. Are we going to people out of their homes? And if so, for how long? What measures do we need to put in place, whether it's interim measures or long-term measures? And even if you can demonstrate that your annual fire safety statement, that's that list that goes in on front reception of every building, is being kept up to date with the standards that are listed in that, it simply means that you're meeting that standard of compliance that's listed, whether it was built in 1970 or whether it was built in 1990 or 2000. It doesn't mean that you comply with the current code. And it certainly doesn't mean that you're absolutely safety, because just because you're fire compliant doesn't mean you're fire safe. And that applies even today. There's no such thing as absolute safety. It just means you're satisfying compliance with the regulatory code. Where are the as-built? That's a question that's often asked, and I see it in the fire safety assessment and the fire risk assessments in the Code of Practice here in Ireland 2023. There's often quite a lot of gaps where little or no documentation on older buildings arise. And then that requires a more detailed, what we call gap analysis or an audit and assessment, whereby you have every man and his dog going through the building, mech-elec, hydraulic, structural, builders, the lot, looking to check what is or is not in this building. And that's quite a large contributing factor to the fire safety standards in buildings, is the level of documentation available. Older buildings, traditionally don't have a lot of documentation. More modern buildings do, but most of these fire orders relate to older buildings. Such as the architectural drawings and all the fire safety systems and penetrations and dampers. There's a lot of information that we have today that wouldn't have been around 20, 30 years ago, where these buildings are being subjected to a fire order, much like the Celtic Tiger era issues that we face today. Continuing on that, a good example of this issue in Australia is, I don't know when it happened, but the effective height of 25 meters is a big thing. So essentially, it's like the over 18s or over 30-meter rules. Once you go above 25 meter in Australia, you need 2 stairs, you need sprinklers, stair pressurization, you need a whole load of other issues just for fire safety alone. Sprinkler being one of them. There used to be a Height of Building Act that said up to 42 meters you're okay as long as you sprinkler the basement and ground floor only. You could put in certain amount of detection on all the upper levels. Now, a building today wouldn't pass, and often a fire order is served because this building at 42 meters doesn't have sprinklers, whereas today it would be triggered at 25 meters. So the council often retrospectively asked you to put in sprinklers into a building that is not more than 42, but it's over 25 meters. And that's sometimes a huge ask. And usually that's where we get involved in some negotiations with them. And sometimes we say, you know what, that's the only option. Other times we don't. Stair pressurization, again, that's related to the height, where sometimes these old stairs are not pressurized at all, or just an injection system at the top, and there wasn't the same requirements or acceptance criteria that there is today, where you check for a certain meter flow rate across the door, or certain pressures inside and outside the space, and relief valves and pressures and everything else. So they often ask for that to be overhauled, which is sometimes easier than it may appear to be. Zone smoke control is like basically pressure differential systems, sandwich systems that are occurring today or in the last 20 years that weren't there 30 years ago. And usually in these old buildings, they'll look, what I'm talking about is the buildings that are more than say 30, 40 years old. They usually have some hydrants, some hose grids and extinguishers, and that's probably it. They don't have a lot of detection or alarms. And quite often that's where the council will go, now it's time to bring your building into the modern world, but we're not going to hit you with everything. We basically want you to get a building surveyor and a fire engineer to come up with a fire safety strategy, an upgrade strategy for your building, bespoke for your building. And then the question often asked is, well, what if it actually does comply with the building or the as built, but not the building code? Well, that's simple. Once a certifier issues an occupation certificate that's in contravention of the building code, well, then they're going to get sued. So all the builders and professionals on that will very quickly get a litigation, and it'll enter into a long, very protracted set of court proceedings, which we have seen and we've been involved in time and time again, whereby a certifier and fire engineers have signed off something that they should not have signed off. And that's why there's insurance, and that's why there's a lot of other protection measures in there. Because in the end, the legislation is written in a way that the consumer is the one to be protected, i.e. the public. So how do we deal with the fire order? And rough step by step, usually on receipt of the order, we engage professionals, project manager, a fire engineer, or a building code consultant. We meet with the council, sit down, listen to them. Listen more than talk. A lot of people get their backs up and go at it saying it's not fair. We've never had any issues. We've done all this. It's not about that. The horse is bolted. So just sit back and listen. The period between the notice and the order is usually 28 days. And sometimes they get legal advice to fight it. Most times it's lost, but it's worthwhile getting it anyway. Then there may be no option but to do performance solutions or alternative solutions, and that's where we come in. And we work hand in hand with the building code consultant, the project manager, and the fire safety officer at council. And we'll have ongoing and follow-up meetings with council on site to ensure that everyone's in the know as to what's been done, how it's been done, when it's been done. And then we'll seek endorsement of that strategy by council. So we'll develop a report and undertake any engineering analysis and that demonstrates compliance with the performance requirements. And usually council will defer to our judgment because we're the licensed ones under the legislation that can only do it. And they're simply seeking our report, which is also checked by a building code consultant as well. Generally, we would recommend audits to be done in the building. As I said before, it could be mechanical, hydraulics, the whole lot. And the rectification would be set out, how it should be set out, the likely cost, the time, disruptions. So there's a whole staging of works that need to be done. And then you assemble the team, including all the active and passive trades, to review both the outcomes of the fire engineering report, but also the outcomes of the building code report. And that way you can plan the next stages of the design, complete the design, send it into council for review and endorsement. Once it's endorsed, engage the builder, tender the works, and subcontract all that out and get all their detailed documentation before any work starts. And then on completion of the works, bearing in mind that we monitor through construction as well, we get the full set of certificates as you would in any normal build. The only thing about it is there's no fire cert, there's no planning, it's a fire order. So the process, whilst more or less done in the same manner, doesn't require an official planning permission, doesn't require an official fire cert. It's all been done in the same manner, but not requiring those legislative processes. It's all done under a fire order. Can you appeal or concessions? Yes, you can. Usually if it's unreasonable, and usually it's very hard to argue that if it's relating to fire safety, that the timing is too short. Generally, you'll just say, listen, give me an extension. 30 days is unreasonable. You need to give me a year to do this because, the scope of works is just too large. Or you may argue that what they're asking you is too much. And you again, you would have a little bit of negotiation with that. And councils usually aren't there to force you to do today's code in a building that was built 30 years ago. There usually is a bit of wiggle room and toing and froing, and it's all about assembling the team to argue that point. Is there dispensations? Yes, usually is for heritage buildings, and there's also guidelines out there from the fire brigade that permit certain relaxations. based on old codes or based on modern operational techniques. And although not a dispensation, the alternative solution process through fire engineering is done in pretty much all buildings that are subject to a fire order. Is there concession? Again, there usually is. That's usually done by the building code consultant, not ourselves. Most of the time, if it's very minor, and minor things such as if the code today requires a metre wide stairs and you're 950 mil, the council and the fire service are very, very, very familiar with the alternative solution process, whereby we can look at the gait and movement of people, the population, and how many people on a floor and how many people on a stair, and they will look at the building and go, yeah, that's fine. You don't even need to do a fire engineering alternative solution for that because that's minor departure, and we're okay with that. So we'll just accept it as it is, and they'll record it as it is. That way, someone coming through later on has it on the record that the council or the fire brigade have accepted that. As I said, there's guidelines from the fire brigade that permit certain concessions, and then you've got the heritage aspect, whereby in today's building code, where you've got 3 or more stories, all the floors and fire-rated walls need to be non-combustible, and obviously old timber buildings are very combustible. So they take that into consideration. How do you comply? You essentially need to get the team together, get expert advice to guide you through the process. This usually means people who are familiar with this process time and time again. There are BCA consultants and fire engineers who have detailed understanding of the science behind the fire safety and the legislation, and are in a position to help manage that process. A fire order is serious, it is crucial, so it's best that it's not ignored. And it's genuinely after the safety of the residents and the public and visitors of that building. So it's not it's not taken on lightly. The council's guide for fixing it, there is no kind of code of practice for upgrading. They usually defer to the current building code, but the building code consultant will usually look at it and go, well, that's not relevant. I can't fix that, or I can't change the heritage timber to concrete, so you're just going to have to accept it. However, we might add certain detection or sprinklers or other compensating measures in there as a bit of a compensating measure, and other items they just have to accept. We cannot touch, we cannot move. And as such, most fire orders are satisfied by when they incorporate alternative solutions to those fire safety strategies designed and developed by accredited and certified fire safety engineers. So the performance solution process is usually features a lot of compliance in new buildings, but these are equally important in existing buildings, older buildings, that can achieve a safer outcome in a more cost-effective manner and a less disruptive fashion. And they're usually done through a stage and sequential basis over a period of months or years sometimes. So how would you comply with it following through? We have a staged approach. Follow the stages in the order. In that program timeline of work, if you find you're getting delayed, you usually tell them, I'm going to be delayed, stage 1 is going to take another 6 months or whatever. Usually they're okay with that. As long as you can show progress, they will accept extensions of time. Undertaking that assessment to understand the level of defects, having a comprehensive fire safety compliance audit of the building and reports, determine it, review it, modify the scope of works as necessary, preparing tender documentation and the process for the proposed works. What I call there SMATA is essentially it's a program that the owners management corporations who are managed under a entity, they use to vet tradespeople. So essentially, if you're going to work on a residential building, you cannot work unless you've been pre-approved. So pre-approved for licensing, registration, and insurance. So essentially, any Joe plumber or electrician cannot simply tender for the work. You have to be pre-approved through the Owners Management Corporation management system. That is a regulated system, essentially to get you on that job. And usually it means the accreditation or the engagement of the accredited professionals that are all registered. So a registered building surveyor, which is like an assigned certifier, acting as a building surveyor, a registered architect, registered essential services, wet and dry, fire engineer, and you know who the nominated council officer is in charge. And that generally is the team that you do. And you have a project manager in there facilitating it. Sometimes the BCA consultant will actually do the project management as well. So the role of what's called a strata is essentially the owner's management company here in Ireland, but it's called a strata in Australia. And the managing agents, these are people who are regulated by law who manage the OMC. So they're an independent body that essentially makes sure that the OMC are doing what they should be doing by law. And they register the strata and the committees members and what they are. They administer the funds and make sure that they're being spent correctly. There's, governance and everything else. They vet the tradespeople, their licensing, the credentials and the insurance. They appoint the BCA consultants and various trades. And they follow a certain process as well. So the process, as I said, you'd have a PM review the tender works, meet the stakeholders, on-site coordination with the supervision of the contractors, regular updates with the progress and the program timeline with the fire brigade or council. They would issue notices to residents that says we're going to do works between this and that hour, or we're going to need to shut off certain lights or do certain testings, or we'll issue closure notices for the lifts or the stairs during periods of time. And they'll all work with the strata or the OMC and the managing agent. They'll set out when the commissioning is going to happen, who's going to be there, what's needed to be done, and provide the final sign off and statements from all the relevant parties. And then the ongoing consultancy and technical support would come from people like ourselves throughout that whole process. So from a conveyancing standpoint, if you've received a fire order, but you've already planned it out and it's agreed with the council about the strategy, someone buying or selling that unit can clearly show that money's been set aside. It's all agreed upfront, and there's going to be a general fire safety improvement of the building, and obviously it reduces risk of future enforcement. The cons are obviously anxiety amongst owners, the cost, and conveyancing if the order hasn't been resolved. The little asterisk, it relates to a project that I was working on in Sydney, whereby they were saving for years for what they knew was going to be a fire order. So it was going to be a voluntary order. And they had saved like $2 million only for a flood event to basically wipe half of their structure near the car park away. And then whenever we had to go to council, we said, listen, it's going to be another 5 years before this is fixed. And council generally agreed to it. So there was interim measures gone in there, but it was the end. So other considerations like heritage, we might have lath and plaster, really old 100-year-old ceilings that are ornate or heritage, which have certain fire resistance levels that maybe only last 15 to 17 minutes or 15 to 27 minutes. The Heritage Council of New South Wales did some fire tests. So they basically subjected these old lath and plaster ceilings to a conventional fire test as you would have today, and found that, if they're built okay and pretty much intact, they might last for 22 minutes. And sometimes that is the consensus. We're not touching it. We might put inchmeson paint on it. And that's a system that they regularly employ in heritage buildings. Or we might, in some cases, retrofit a sprinkler system if it's really bad. Usually it's on the really bad ones that ends up, but not often. And then we have what is called in Australia massive timber, or we might call it CLT, but these old buildings that used to be warehouse buildings that are now fancy apartments that wouldn't be built today in this way, shape, or form. So we end up getting involved in doing charring rates and analysis about, how long that column will last in a fire. That's reinforced in there with some steel as per the structural engineer's recommendation, because the joint connection in there wasn't going to survive much more than, say, 20 minutes. So the recommendation there was that went in with some inchmeson paint, and the columns would char for 60 minutes and still have structural stability. And we were able to do the calculations that show that the fire wouldn't burn for much more than 60 minutes by doing fire severity calculations. Coming into the final slides, where the main point here is to talk to the experts, engage qualified chartered fire engineers, follow published codes of guidance, and like the ones in the Code of Practice for Remediation of Fire Safety Defects here in Ireland, get the approved design, specs, test reports and assessments, have a competent fire safety professionals for active and passive systems. This applies whether it's a fire order or not, to be honest, but it's the same process as I said before we follow. Getting the relevant experience in doing fire orders, not just normal day-to-day stuff. Talk to council, keep them informed, keep them updated, let them know that you're progressing, because the less you communicate with them, the more enforcement you're going to get from them. Having a known and accepted understanding of the process of the fire orders, planning for it, saving capital works fund or the sinking fund, the timelines, knowing what disruptions and how to plan around them. Having engaged a fire safety engineer, a building code consultant, and project management is probably the consultant that you would have to have on fire order, regular meetings with the OMCs and the fire service and the council just to keep everyone updated, have a fully documented design and specs before you start, rather than going straight into it, having accredited installers of these passive and active systems, updates to the as-builts, including all the certificates and specifications, keep the communications open and continue that to all. And the final slide is really a reference to the code of practice here in Ireland for remediation of fire safety defects. So that's generally it. Thanks for everyone joining, and sorry for the tech issues. Meter will be capped up the next time.
I have a few questions, Mark, if you're willing to take them there.
Yeah, go for
it. I'm interested in the digitalization of your register of strata connected to the professions. Does that happen out in New South Wales?
Yes.
And so the nominated council officer who would serve such an order, would they form part of that registration?
No, there's no legislative requirement for them to be part of that, and their role is purely administrative. They actually don't sign off anything. The fire brigade don't sign off anything. The only people who sign off is the accredited fire engineer and the accredited building surveyor, or the assigned certifier, if you want to use Irish terms. They're merely administrating the role, and whilst they have a really good understanding of the building code and fire engineering and all of that, if something really smells off, they will call it. They'll say, I don't agree with you, and we don't agree with that solution that you're putting forward. Whereas if see it and they've seen it before, they might even ask for it to be peer reviewed. But essentially, they're not endorsing anything. They're basically saying, under the legislation, I'm going to ask you to do X. And part of X is a building surveyor, accredited, licensed, chartered, and insured, is the person going to give me a letter that says everything complies with the order that I issued. So essentially, the council are administrating the process, but the professionals are the ones signing it off. And those are the people, including the trades that do the work, that are vetted through that digital platform.
Okay, so then the obligation to record an AFSS, is that an annual requirement that each premises needs to display and update?
Every single building since 1993 or 94 has to display an annual fire safety system on their property, except dwelling houses. Every single building.
And you were on about predicting or analyzing for gaps or defects. I presume it's the likes of your own professions over there in New South Wales that would update those AFSS. And is it, do you plan ahead, future-proof such documentation to allow for sink funds associated with premises that are run by these OMCs?
To give you an idea, I'm an owner of an apartment building in Sydney, and I had an AGM the night before last, and part of that AGM was approving a 10-year budget. And in that 10-year budget, we talk about balustrade upgrades or concrete cancer or, retaining walls or whatever else. But we've set aside hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years to the just in case fund. And it's all about, okay, the sliding doors in a lot of these old buildings, they're getting worn. So we need to plan for it. So we have to, by law, have a 10-year plan. We have to have an insurance evaluation. We have to submit the annual fire safety statement every single year by law. And in doing so, we have to engage appropriate professionals, qualified registered professionals, to conduct the checking of those systems. So fire extinguishers, emergency lights, exits, every single system in the building that is listed as an essential measure, they have to check every single year and submit the paperwork to council and the fire brigade every single year. And by law, the OMC are responsible because they're the owners of the building.
Okay, I see from your CV record there that you have been an expert witness in some court cases. So if there's registration of professions and stratas, if there's any requirement for AFSs, if the nominated council officer can serve orders 1, 2, and 3 at different levels, allowing for time and space and fair and natural justice to be accounted for, where does it all go wrong? That leads you to court.
Usually these are older buildings, so it's a bit like the Celtic Tiger era. So you want to look at where B car is now versus where B car was 10, 12 years ago. Buildings that you might audit that are 14 years old today in Ireland, you'll find bigger problems than the ones built, say, 4 years ago. That's usually where it goes wrong. So a lot of these older buildings, or else the certifier or the fire engineer on certain jobs just didn't do the job correctly. As simple as that. And often I've been on expert witness cases and having to take the stand and in the Supreme Court say to a certifier, you missed it. That's wrong. You know, you blatantly missed all fire stopping because you didn't inspect it. You took a piece of paper, and this is where the legislation has been shown to be lacking in some respects. The legislation basically says an installer has to provide an installation certificate confirming compliance with that particular part, whatever he's doing. So say it's a fire stopping system. The certifier has an obligation to accept it if he's registered, if that installer is registered. Now, there's also an onus to check that work, but they don't always check that work. Or the law might say you need to check 30% of each floor's fire stopping, and it has to be representative of each type of fire stopping. But that doesn't mean every single fire stopping is checked. It's only 30%. So the fire stopping installers might go, oh, well, I'm going to do level 4 today. And then that's the guy, that's where he's going to come because he's looking at something else, and they'll try something shady. So it does go wrong. But that's where the legal process comes in and captures it.
Is there any proposal over there to update their 1979 Act? Is that what you said they have?
Although it's a 1979 Act, there's a coinciding legislation in 2000. But in New South Wales particularly, there's been other acts come in 20, 21, 22, and 20, almost every year for the last 4 years, that specifically deal with residential buildings, and that also specifically deal with the registration of professionals that work in residential buildings. So the legislation 1979 is a very broad encompassing one. So it's like the planning controls. This is like the Planning and Development Act. And when you read it today, it actually reads quite well today as it did in 1979. It's not about compliance in terms with Part B or anything else. That's reserved in the building code. This is just the legislation that it's enacted under. So although it's 1979, it really just deals with the processes of how you do a fire order, the processes of serving an order, and then it'll refer you to this code, or refer you to the latest license requirement, or refer you to the minister having made other relations, and that's usually where it's captured today. So the problems that we saw, say, 12 years ago are not the same problems that we see today, thankfully.
Okay, so there's a question specific here to tall mass timber buildings in Australia. 18-meter rule. How do the regs in Australia differ in that respect?
So there's a number, they don't have.
Sorry, the emphasis is on tall mass timber buildings, yeah.
Yeah, so essentially, they have what's called Type A, Type B, and Type C construction. Type C construction can be combustible, and it generally only covers single-story buildings or maybe two-story buildings. Type B and A construction are 3 and more stories, and they all need to be non-combustible. So that's not even to do with fire separation. All the floors, the external walls, any fire-rated elements all need to be non-combustible once they're 3 or more stories. And then you have, it's not an 18-meter rule, it's a 25-meter rule. So for a residential building, it's essentially at 25 meters, it requires sprinklers, stair pressurization, 2 stairs, emergency lift, voice-activated emergency warning systems. It requires detection that is much more. A normal building requires detection, but basically there's 10 extra requirements on a building over 25 that wouldn't be there at 24 meters. But in terms of emphasis on mass timber building, that is something that is not prescriptively compliant. So that is pure fire engineering performance solution.
Okay, perfect. Okay, Mark, I think we'll leave it there for the evening.